Hi, everyone. So, as promised, here is this concise, run through of my research into, and this is a passion area of mine and has been for as long as I've been practicing the craft, the history or the histories or the perspective on history of witchcraft, and largely, and especially as witchcraft is an English word, largely I try to respect other cultures that do not speak English and don't have English as a prevailing metaphor. And I try not to comment on their sorceress and spirit working traditions, which may be very parallel, and maybe many people in that region use, the word witchcraft or the translated words of witchcraft to speak about their own practices or speak about the folk magic and the folk customs in their cultures and their traditions. So mainly my expertise, my studies over the past 20 years in a historical context are really based on the witch trials in Europe, and some in Turtle Island, North America, like the New England trials or the Salem witch trials is the most obvious version of those. I also have paid a lot of attention to the histories of the revival movements of witchcraft in countries like Britain and the United States and Australia. So I invite you to take a breath, or to know that you are breathing and to notice your breath. And maybe you do some wiggling and adjusting. I like to click and clap just to release any knots or bindings, or just to scatter anything that I don't need distracting me. It's also a nice trick to get the attention of your fetch, so that my speaking is more connected to instinct and emotion and memory and the sorceress life force that's moving through me at all times. So I think where I'll probably begin, I have all these books to help, because some people like books and also want recommendations. So I'm going to be showing books along the way. I think where I'm going to actually begin, and I'm going to work in various directions of time, is with I'm just going to begin with Gerald Gardner. And that, I think, is both an obvious move and also a contentious one. But certainly Gerald Gardner, who was an English civil servant, who was, I think, born in 1884. This is testing me now. And who died in 1964, maybe. Anyway, so he is known as the father of modern witchcraft in the West. And certainly his claim or his experience of being initiated into a clandestine coven of self-identified witches in 1939 in the New Forest, or next to the New Forest, is the claim or the experience that kind of has, really catapulted contemporary witchcraft into the public eye. And certainly Gardner was one of the first, self-proclaimed witches in the media in the 1950s, 1951, I believe. That that whole proclamation and that whole momentum did definitely bring out other witches, and I can talk about that in a minute, because certainly a lot of the early Gardnerians constantly reference these witches who they at the time would call traditional or hereditary witches, and we still do. And so I just wanted to talk a bit about that. I am not a Gardnerian initiate. I am not an Alexandrian initiate. I am not an initiate of any lineaged Wiccan tradition. And so that's that caveat, but I definitely have studied most of the published material, and I've taken an interest in modern witchcraft history in general, because it does impact my practice. So Gardner's kind of thing was that he believed he had found, I don't know what the original group, which more and more evidence by academics and historians shows that group likely did exist. That, and if you want to go into that, I'm not going to go into that. If you want to go into that, please read Philip Heselton's books on the matter, and also, which I do have one around here, but I think it's called In Search of the New Forest Coven, but also Cauldron of Inspiration is very good. I think better than Search for the New Forest Coven. And also, please read Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon. But what Gardner believed was that he had found a continuing coven of a theory, or a theory that Margaret Murray, who was a preeminent Egyptologist in her time, but also had taken this deep interest in the thesis that there was this kind of organized witch cult. I think she used that term, and Gardner used it in favor of that as well. That was a continuation of a pre-Christian pagan religion that had kind of corrupted over time. And they met in clandestine covens and at the Sabbat and at Esbats. And they would, have kind of clothed, antlered, horned, bestial, costumed man who may or may not have been the high priest or the devil or the magister, depending on what source you're reading, and that there were naked or clothed, depending, witches who met in-person, in-fleshed Sabbat meetings, so not like otherworldly forays or spirit flight, which there's a lot of evidence for in folklore and in study of folklore and in study of witch trials themselves. But these clandestine in-person meetings, and so Gardner felt or believed that he had found one of the last covens that was holding those traditions, and potentially they believed that, or they had taken on the Margaret Murray hypothesis, and which has been discredited, and they believed it wholesale. Now, there are parts of the Margaret Murray hypothesis or Margaret Murray's findings or research or storying that actually probably does have poetic truth and mythic truth. And certainly I can be really clear, and I'll say this through all my practice and through all my research and through all my experience of initiations in different traditions and studying and talking to a lot of different witches. I actually am of the perspective that there have been and always are people who know themselves to be witches or witch type beings, or uncanny or born with sorceress power. I mean, that's just known throughout the world in all cultures, and that they either are identified and revered and venerated and sometimes feared and respected in their villages, tribes, communities, families, and that also even in pre-Christian times in Europe, we have literature and evidence that certainly in Viking culture and in Roman imperialist society, that people who could do these things or were identified as witches or wizards or necromancers or soothsayers, or those who flew at night, which is a long established idea in many cultures, were dangerous and should be killed. And this is even before this Christianist idea of thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, which may or may not be a mistranslation in the King James Bible, actually takes hold and and supports the systematic witch persecutions in both ecclesiastical and secular courts throughout Europe and in the colonies that European nations established in sovereign unceded territories all over the world. So, I'm just going to, so back to Gerald Gardner. So this is what he believed. And he established wove together from what he had inherited and from his studies of folklore and the witch trials and other magical systems and traditions. He wove together, put together, filled in a tradition that he never called the Gardnerian tradition, but that was later called the Gardnerian tradition. Originally, that is said to have been like a denigration, a slur by Robert Cochrane, who was a self-identified hereditary witch. We would now call what he was doing traditional witchcraft, and he countered Gardner and Gardner's covens and high priestesses, etc., and was basically saying, well, this is not witchcraft as I understand it. These are Gardnerians, right? And so that's where that comes from. And Gardnerianism, a really good book. I already referenced it. Wicca by Vivian Crowley is probably, I think, the best and most comprehensive one to read. And Alexandrian Wicca is really, as I understand it, and Gardnerians and Alexandrians have told me, basically branch of Gardnerian Wicca that basically altered and added like quite a bit of ceremonial magic, angelic magic, Kabbalistic, like Hermetic Kabbalistic magic, and became really its own flavor and system, but still has lineage to, well, supposedly to Gardnerian Wicca. And certainly the Farrers, Janet and Stuart Farrer, wrote this book, and with the help of Joan Valiente, who was really Gardner's first Gardnerian high priestess, you could say. And she was initiated in 1953, and she rewrote and also wrote many of the rituals that are past in the Book of Shadows and in Wiccan traditions, supposedly. I don't know. This is what I get from published texts and Doreen's own words. And also, the charge of the goddess as we have it today. There were previous charges that she altered and changed. So if you come across, references to Wicca, which you all would have because it's a very popularized term in the West, really what it originally references is Gardnerian and Alexandrian witchcraft, which Gardner never used the word Wicca to refer to his witchcraft. He actually didn't use it a great deal. And when he used that word, and maybe it's actually a different word, he actually spelt it in a strange way, W-I-C-A. And actually the word Wicca should not be pronounced like that at all, like W-I-C-C-A. It's an Old English word, and it's meant to be pronounced like witcher. And it actually is the male version of the word witche, which is the feminine way of referring to a witch in Old English. And what they meant in the 11th century when using that word is a woman who, or a man, witcher, or whoever, I'm sure they just thought they were women and men, who were working with sorcery and unsanctioned non-Christian demons in order to bring ruin to the harvests and to kill babies, etc., to do nefarious things. And also, any practicing of sorcery and magic that wasn't sanctioned by the church or religious courts, of course, was witchcraft, right? And so Gardner wove this together, this Gardnerian craft, and it's still being passed today. It's one of the oldest continuing modern witchcraft traditions. And alongside that, in the same decades, in the 40s and 50s, which is really interesting, something was happening. There were other people who were identifying and expressing as witches in at least 2 other continents, in Turtle Island, so-called North America, and in so-called Australia, at the same time. And so we have evidence, either their letters or their art exhibitions or their journals or their newspaper articles, and certainly have these things. You can look them up, about the Andersons, Victor and Cora Anderson in the US, and of Rosalie Norton in Australia. This is a really good book, Pan's Daughter. I've got the revised and expanded edition by Neville Drury, who passed a few years ago. So, there are other traditions of witchcraft that run parallel to the Gardnerian stream that may have some influence later on, or have even been kind of inspired and instigated and provoked by Gardner's media-ness to actually go, oh, okay, well, I guess we can be a little bit more public about what we do and who we are. And certainly both the Andersons and Rosalie Norton did actually write to and share letters with Gerald Gardner. To my knowledge, and to the knowledge of the people who are in the know, I do not believe that the Andersons, either Victor or Cora or Rosaline, were ever initiated into Gardnerian or Alexandrian lineages, and certainly even at times would be like, oh, maybe we're not like you. And that is what we call traditional witchcraft. And this is where today it's still contentious. But generally speaking, we have what in the US is sometimes called British traditional Wicca, which in Europe, I think they just call Wicca. Or, and everyone kind of knows, and who practices these things, oh, that's Gardnerians and Alexandrians. But there is this kind of counter movement that began in the late 50s and early 60s, originally, instigated, I guess, or in the literature, in the periodicals, in the magazines, by Robert Cochrane. And certainly there are parallels. Like if I look at the whole thing if I look at all initiatory witchcraft, there are certainly parallels. There are witch gods. There is this idea that you have to go through ritualistic magical initiation to enter the clan, the coven, the order, the group. There are officers who hold certain like authority. So this would be a high priest or a high priestess or a second degree or a magister or a maiden or the grand master. Or whoever the lady, like there are humans who hold certain offices of authority within these lineages, within these groups, within these orders, within these clans, and there is secret information and secret law and private ritual that is passed, whether it's encoded in a book like a Book of Shadows or another witch's grimoire or not. Maybe it's more oral, or there are a variety of things that are passed, sometimes objects that they pass, like down the line, and that people have a common context and a common cauldron to gather around, and therefore to have a tradition. And so a lot of these traditions, in the modern sense of the witchcraft word in the West, are like variants, or even maybe variants is even the wrong term, because it's not as if there was an original system that broke up. There are multiple, in the traditional witchcraft context, we would say there are multiple, almost infinite witchcrafts, right? And I think one of the contentions, the original contentions with Gerald Gardner's kind of wholesale or very Margaret Murray influence, is that there were all these other witchcrafts in Britain at the time that were saying, hey, it's actually not like that. We don't have covens, we don't all have covens with high priests and high priestesses in 3 degrees, which is a very Masonic, like that's pretty much imported from Freemasonry. We might just have 1 initiation or 2 initiations, and maybe actually cross-gender initiation is not a thing with us. Certainly there are folk traditions that require, like in many cultures, that require something to be passed from woman to man, in that idea, in that binary idea. That is actually quite an old idea in some folk traditions. And obviously they adapt as people learn more. And certainly that is a contention in modern witchcraft. However, there are many traditions like the Anderson Fairy tradition, as far as I know, Rosaline Norton's tradition, the Goat Fold, and many other contemporary craft traditions where either it's the magister who initiates everyone, or the lady who initiates everyone, regardless of gender, or anyone initiating anyone, right? Anyone who's been initiating anyone else. So that goes on. Whereas in Gardner's original vision or teachings, this idea of initiating cross-gender. So a man would initiate a woman, would initiate a man, would initiate a woman, etc. So that is an idea you will come across. And what I'm trying to get at now is that there is, in the contemporary witchcraft renaissance, which really is now, how old is this? If we look at the publication of Witchcraft Today, which was the first book in the West, I think, that was published by someone who's saying, I am a witch and here is witchcraft. So in 1954, Gerald Gardner had Witchcraft Today published. If we take it from there, God, it's been how long? Like nearly 70 years, maybe, of this revival movement, and of other movements, counter movements like traditional witchcraft, that say other things. And certainly almost every Gardnerian high priestess that I've read published works from, they all almost reference the legitimacy and the validity of an older witchcraft, previous to Gardner, by referencing these other witches. So Lois Bourne referencing Monica English, who is supposedly part of a coven called the Grey Goose or the Grey Feather Coven, which had a magister and a magistra, and had a different way of working power than the Gardnerians, and potentially had different gods, etc. And then there's Patricia Crowther, who references Jean MacDonald, a Scottish witch, who sent some of her items, to Patricia Crowther, supposedly. But she goes out of her way to reference this woman, who is not a Gardnerian, but whose traditions kind of might enlighten us to what Gardner was drawing upon, etc. Then there's Eleanor Bone, or Ray Bone, who was talking about her initiation in Cumbria into a Cumbrian hereditary folk witch tradition in the 1940s, before she was ever initiated by Gardnerians. Then there's, of course, Joan Valiente, who actually left Gardner's stream of witchcraft quite early on, even though she had so much impact on the tradition in a way. And she went off and got initiated in 3 other traditions, or 3 other branches of the craft, as she said. I think she also subscribed in some ways to the Margaret Murray hypothesis. And she kind of, there was a Sussex group that she was initiated into. There was this Cardell group that I'm not going to go into. If you want to look at that, go for it. And then there was, I believe, Cochrane. Oh, well, actually, I don't believe that's known. She told us Cochrane's group that she was initiated into. And so there are all these other groups, right? And some of these groups as well. One of the best things I ever read was, I think it was Orion Foxwood who articulated it this way. So there are a lot of people in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in countries like Australia or Aotearoa in New Zealand, or US or Canada, or various parts of Europe or Brazil or South Africa or Indonesia or wherever, who had been passed or in some way initiated into sorceress, spirit working, folk tradition of magic that could easily be called witchcraft, and probably would have been by someone pointing at it. But because of this huge Wicca thing that was started to be leaked out with works by the Farrers and Lady Sheba, and certainly also this important book, Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft, the Farrers, I think, were more in the 80s, but certainly Lady Sheba, Paul Hewson, they actually in the early 70s started publishing some material that was potentially oath-bound. So this huge wave of this is what witchcraft is, this is Wicca, had these other people who'd inherited folk traditions or spirit working custom or whatever from families or from other teachers go, oh, that sounds a little like what I do, so that must be a source. And so they took whatever published material they could, and some traditions began to become a bit Wiccanized, many of them did, to share language, but also potentially to move closer to what they thought was more valid and more legitimate, actually, interestingly enough. And so now we have all of these traditions and orders of craft that might use similar language, but there are diversities. Like, I'm interested in the distinctions as much as I am the samenesses. I've been involved in craft workings that don't reference the elements ever, that in rituals and workings will not use verbal language at all. That don't just have a god and a goddess, or a god herself and a consort, but like maybe 4 or 6 witch gods. And certainly, that this variety, this distinction is important. And it's, I think, one of the greatest contentions in witchcraft is this strange, maybe American dogmatism that does influence a lot of witchdom and pagandom in the West, because it's trying to have everything kind of monocultured. And certainly that is I think one of the greatest contentions for the original groups of witches, traditional witches we would call now, or folk witches, who are like, hey Gardner, slow down, slow your roll. Unfortunately, there has been and continues to be a lot of vitriol, and realistically, there doesn't need to be. A witch is a witch is a witch is a witch. And certainly, this is me working back in time, there is not this, it's actually more in the past that someone would point at you, and this is not what you probably wanted, and say you're a witch, because they'd identified certain things that were uncanny or odd or strange, or they'd invented this narrative that maybe you were a diabolical night riding hag who was, sucking the life force out of the crops and the children and the livestock, which is a common motif in this diabolical witchcraft idea from medieval times into the early modern period in Europe and many cultures in the world, actually. So there is this pervasive idea in most cultures that there are night flying, nocturnal, sorcerously capable, often feminine figures, often women, who are like vampiric night witches. That idea is so common that I grew up with it with my Balinese father, and we have a word for what they are, and it's layak. And now in modern Bali, you will actually find people who say they practice layak and will say, actually, it's just a power that you can wield for, for good or evil, or for boon or bane, or for blessing or blasting, and that seems to actually be a thing in almost all magical traditions as well. But there is this long established idea in almost all human societies that there are maleficent sorcerers and maleficent sorceress powers and spirits that want to destroy or kill or murder. And that's something that's hard to contend with in the modern world when we have people who are experiencing themselves as witches in countries where it's safe to do so, and using that term, which in African nations or in certain Asian nations or in Papua New Guinea can have you killed. Like there are still people and societies and cultures that will kill you if they suspect that you are practicing witchcraft or sorcery. So that needs to be known, and that tension needs to be appreciated and looked into as well. Certainly, I love the word witch. It's when I awakened to my witch blood, when I awakened to the fact that I was experiencing myself as witch when I was 11 and 12, that word, that word did things to me. It's one of the few words in the English language, as I often say, that describes my experience of life. And so certainly there are all over the world in many cultures and in many times, these people who are born with predispositions or proclivities to magical success, with predispositions or proclivities to be able to perceive and work with spirits and old powers and land ancestors and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and are able to track certain things and give oracular information that turns out to be correct in the middle world too, and also can find lost objects. Like this is more and more getting into the cunning people. So this is a good book if you want to understand the cunning folk. Emma Wilby is a great source, and as is Owen Davies, of understanding the cunning people's place. So that's a very English term. But these people exist in all cultures. Again, my other reference point is Bali, and we have Balians of many kinds. Balians who are mediums to the spirits, Balians who specialize in herb law, Balians who specialize in midwifery or bone setting or exorcism or other forms of what I would call spellcraft to attract good fortune or find lost objects. Like these professional, that's a helicopter, these professional magicians and kind of like socially approved of magical workers, although it's never black and white. Interestingly, they're sometimes called white witches by people in the communities, or by people in the communities. These people have been in our societies for a long time too, and at times there is said to be this division between, and this language is used, between black witches and white witches. And certainly for the practitioners or the professional magicians or the spirit workers, maybe they participated in using that language because it was good for business. Oh, there's a witch harassing your cattle. Oh, I have the counterspell, for instance, but actually what I know should be true is it's much more gray. It's much more wild. It's not so binary as we have discovered most things in life are not, right? And certainly, the lore that I've inherited from a variety of sources and people and initiates in the craft is that witches are much more concerned with advocating for and working with the non-human in a way, the other than human, the more than human, the flame between the horns, the bestial, the primal, the land, then perhaps we are in advocating always for the interests of humans. However, our bodies of knowledge and the bodies of knowledge that are spirits and gods and ancestors will of course work for humans as well. And certainly my current working definition of witchcraft is that it is non-sanctioned, in brackets by empire, sorcery and spirit work that is often transgressive and that often breaks boxes that empires and societies have placed there to control or coerce different classes of people. And it's ecstatic, and it's often chthonic and land-based. So often witches are drawing from the underworld, from the inner world, from the forest, from the desert, from the mountain, and often literature, myth, folk story shows us going out, out of the cities to meet in clandestine ways, that clandestine idea, in hidden, secretive ways to call up our old gods. And certainly, if we go further back than the medieval period and further back than Christ, we have in the first few centuries leading up, like in the first and second and third and fourth BCE centuries, you actually have these Roman writers and some Greek writers, or them talking about Greek writers, writing about witches and sorcerers, and talking about them being priestesses of, or acolytes to, or dedicants to these gods, who are often chthonic. Persephone, Hecate, we have Kirke and Medea who are praying and propitiating these gods, the gods below, the old gods, the titans, the ones before the gods of civilization, order, and culture. These are the gods that witches are often covenanted with. And certainly, if we flash forward to medieval Christian Europe and the early modern period, there's this idea that witches are covenanted with the devil or Satan, who is the adversary to the Christian God, the adversary to Jesus. And we have this idea, this strong idea that, this is a great book that distills that, the Compendium Maleficarum, right? This is a book by an Italian, maybe an Italian inquisitor, but when was this published? I thought it was in the 1500s originally, but I'm trying to find, this edition is obviously 1988. Like, already I'm breathless because there's just so much to get through. But certainly there's, especially in continental Europe, in France, in Germany, in Spain, and certainly in Italy, you have this idea, this strong narrative of the demonological sabbatic witch, who is defaming and decrying and breaking covenant with the Christian church and the Christian God, stepping on crosses, blaspheming the host, etc. And then reorienting that covenant to Satan or the devil, who is the enemy of God and wants to destroy Christendom. So this idea, this paranoia, is coming up at the same time as plagues and crusades and later on the Protestant Reformation. Like you notice the fear of witchcraft, of organized witchcraft, especially of diabolical witchcraft, and the fear of witches rises at times of crisis and stress. Obviously, this is a sociological phenomenon, and certain scholars and academics have therefore interpreted that data as saying there was never witchcraft. It's all like a paranoia of the European mind, which is bullshit, because there have always been people who we could, call witches. One of my mentors in the craft once said, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, like witch is also a term, like a convenient term, but it's a convenient term that is a very powerful term that impacts. It's one of those terms that is so confusing, disorienting, irrational to some people, unscientific to some, feminine to some, like monstrous to some, or beautiful and empowering, all at the same time. And certainly we in the modern witchcraft world have to contend with all of it. My philosophy and ethos in this is when I call myself a witch, or am called a witch, and certainly I have been by people who don't even know me, in cultures I've moved through, in societies that I've moved through, we have to really contend with it all. Like, we can't really throw the baby out with the bathwater. And certainly, as well as this, though, I hold that in one hand, and in the other hand, there are a lot of misconceptions that one has to correct, like this idea of infanticide, that witches and Jews, like this is like a thing that European Christian society said of witches and Jews, or of any person or group that they didn't like, and wanted to scapegoat, that these groups are killing children and babies. Like, wrong, obviously, but what about, we go into other things like, oh, but witches work with the devil. Well, that's more nuanced. Like, who is the devil, and who is talking about this devil, and what is this spirit who is named the devil, right? And in certain small bioregions and societies, that word is interpreted in different ways. That word has, in some places, an amoral rather than an immoral meaning, and actually might simply refer to, oh, that wee little devil who lives under that tree in that forest, and some women at night go to that devil, you know, blah, blah, blah. And certainly there's that old adage that the gods of the old become the old religions become the devils of the new, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, I'm getting a bit lost here, to be frank, because it's like a swirling mass. But there is some other things that, you know, it's that the early witches, like from Gardner's contemporaries and onwards, would say, like there's this idea of, oh, we don't do any harm. In fact, we have this reed, or this threefold law, and you know, and certainly Gardnerian and Alexandrian witches. I've read many interviews and many books of, that will just say this stuff, like, oh, we don't do that because of the threefold law, and we don't do that because of the reed, and ye harm none, do what ye will, or and it harm none, do what you will. You know, if it harms no one or nothing, do whatever you want. And apparently that's more of, you know, speaking only about actions that harm and that don't harm. So what about actions that harm, or that maybe has a different saying, etc. But then there are early Gardnerian writers who actually do go into this threefold law thing, which is interesting. And it does make sense though, that when you're trying to live your life as a witch, especially as a religious witch or a spiritual witch in the 1950s and 60s, and you're kind of outing other witches or saying that we exist, you kind of want to let people know that we're just like everyone else. And so, you know, there's that we're human, and that we have families that we care about, and that we're loving, ethical people, which I actually think is all true. And certainly the other stuff, that we practice curses and bindings, and that we have nocturnal gatherings, and maybe, you know, transgress other social mores that are ridiculous anyway. But in certain periods, if you were found out doing these things, you would lose your children, you would lose your job, your house would be, you might be in physical danger, your house or you might be lit on fire. Like, these things happened and continue to happen. But, you know, from the safety of so-called Brisbane in Australia, I can be this public witch, and none of that is going to happen to me. You know, most probably I have been on the receiving end of harassment, but not because I'm a witch, but not often. And certainly I have received some disgusting emails, but that's about it. You know, I live in a very different world than those early revivalists and early witches did. And so, you know, this is another good book, The Discovery of Witchcraft. This is something that by Reginald Scott. So I like to show this book because he unwittingly, or wittingly, I don't know. So he basically was like, witchcraft isn't real. Let me show you how it's not real. But what he did was he ended up creating and publishing and putting out there a very workable grimoire, because in his crusade to let everyone in Europe, or who could read his English, know that witches, it's ridiculous. How could witches exist, especially if you are a Christian and believe God is all powerful? How could these people have godlike powers, etc., etc.? The devil is not that powerful, blah, 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 blah. He included a lot of like folk customs, folk spells, and things that witches were said to do by the people, perhaps even by witches themselves. And he included that all in this book. It became, for some people, a grimoire. And that's a whole thread that deeply impacts the modern witchcraft movement and witchcraft in general, is these grimoires, these books of magic. And certainly the cunning people, these professional magicians who, like, they were very popular. Like, these weren't just people living on a hut at the edge of the village that only two people would see. For many decades and hundreds of years in Europe and Britain, Scotland, Ireland, fairy doctors, whatever, seers, soothsayers, these people were very popular. People would go to them for all kinds of reasons, especially to, you know, cure ailments within themselves or the animals that they were raising, stuff around land, finding lost objects, divining if you were in fact cursed by a malevolent spirit worker or witch, etc., and undoing those things. Many of those cunning people and wizards and white witches, as they were often called too, were literate, and if they weren't, they would keep books around them, because these books were powerful objects. And and the Bible, one of the most powerful, impactful books in the world's history, as a magical item to draw virtue and power from. And so that idea, you'll come across time and again these folk magical traditions like hoodoo, southern conjure, that proliferates throughout the southern United States, where these psalms or passages from the Bible are actually used to work magic, drawing power from this very powerful book, in a heretical way, in a way that would be heretical within Christianity, but in a way that folk have done since Christianity, I guess. This syncretism, this natural mixing of things. So when you hear as well this this modern like decrying of eclecticism, like drawing from many sources, that's hilarious, because most practitioners of magic draw from many sources, and often the criticism there is actually more about disrespecting things out of context, which I agree with, and that gets us into cultural misappropriation and cultural theft, and even also on a magical sorceress level, offending certain spirits and offending certain powers, or taking a strategy or a spell or a recipe out of its context and deflating it, and no longer continuing the power that passes if you do it in the right order, in the right way as it's passed. So I agree with those things, but certainly all traditions are and all forms of magic are in some way eclectic, or have become more eclectic, because we adapt, we syncretize, we go, oh, that is working, or there's huge cultural shifts, as happened for those who were enslaved and brought across the the Atlantic to South America and so-called North America, and who were bringing their ancestral spirit working, devotional, ancestral traditions with them, and who did have spirit workers and professional magicians and professional priesthoods and oracles, and who would merge or hide originally some of this stuff under Christianity, under Catholicism, under saints, under psalms, under Christian ways of working or Christian phraseology. But over time, that actually just seeps in, and people consider it a source of power, a source of relevance, a source of cultural context. And some people may even be like, well, yes, let's take that power of the oppressors and work with it in our own system. So you will actually see this in European traditions as well. So this idea of there being a pure pagan pre-Christian witchcraft that just kind of continues on is ludicrous for that reason. Now, that's not me saying that pagan elements haven't survived. I think only an idiot would say, I think only someone who has an agenda against that for some reason would say they haven't. It is so clear in the names of the days, of the week, in English and most other Romance languages, in the name, in our months, in our knowledge of Greek and Roman mythology, in our continued folk knowledge of witches. And certainly simple little rituals that we participate in have pagan origins and pagan roots. It's kind of incontestable. What that means and how that impacts us, that's an interesting study. So, witchcraft, there's a saying in many witchcraft traditions and witchcraft groups, do what works. And I would add to that, respectfully, knowledgeably, wisely, right? And so after you have these early folk, Gardner, Alexanders, who came after Gardner, Robert Cochrane, Doreen Valiente, the Andersons, Rosaline Norton, the guy from 1734, Joseph Wilson, Lady Circe, Sybil Leek, all of these people who are promulgating these traditions and orders of initiatory witchcraft, right? You also then have a movement that begins from the mid-70s into the 80s. And this is a movement, especially in the United States, of feminism mixing, and politics and civil disobedience mixing with witchcraft in probably what to many of those initiated witches in these Gardnerian orders, etc., were like, what the fuck, we don't mix politics with. And this is not everyone, but this is something that's, again, written down in books like Drawing Down the Moon by Margot Adler, and Bull of Heaven by Michael Lloyd, cataloging this tension between the next the next great tension in the revival and the establishment of the witchcraft movement, which is feminist witches and traditional witches. Meanwhile, there are all sorts of traditional witches. Do you know what I mean? But this idea of lineaged initiatory witches that go back to Gardner and practice, this cross-gender initiation that have 3 degrees and have a high priestess and a high priest, etc., and a goddess of fertility and life and renewal and a god of death and resurrection, kind of hitting loggerheads with potentially witches like Susanna Budapest and maybe even Starhawk through either misinterpretations of their work or just outright hatred of this idea that there would be women or witches who would gather and only venerate goddesses or only venerate the great goddess, and kind of to the exclusion of any male or non-female spirits, right? So, which sounds ridiculous, but if but if you're just paying attention to anything going on or throughout history, is like, oh yeah, that happens. So Susanna Budapest is said to be one of the mothers of the Dianic witchcraft movement, but there are others. There's also Morgan McFarland, who, along with her male partner at the time, whose name's Mark, I think, in the 70s, wove together all kinds of material from literature, from folklore, from potentially hereditary traditions of magic they'd inherited, like Susanna Budapest from her Hungarian mother. That's where she was born and raised before she emigrated, into these covens and witchcrafts for and of women, right? And certainly Starhawk, one of the most seminal feminine witches of the movement, who is alive to this day, certainly that impacted her. And this book, which came out in the same year, on the same night or day as Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, on opposite coasts of the US, so the Spiral Dance and Drawing Down the Moon, came out on Northern Hemisphere Halloween 1979. They both deeply impacted, I guess, the self-reflection of what witchcraft was becoming for literally thousands of people at this point. And books like this, and books like this, which came out after Starhawk's book, and books like this, which came out, I think, in 1970 or 1971, so 9 or 8 years earlier than Starhawk's book, they are very like DIY witchcraft books. Like, they begin this trend of books that basically are saying, here's a handbook of witchcraft, here's what you need to know to establish your practice, or a coven, right? And so this is one of the other great contentions, is it starts, I guess, the eclectic do-it-yourself movement of witches, who either are drawing upon what they consider to be, very folkloric, established traditional ideas of witches, or these feminist idea readings and interpretations of witches, like woman's power and reclaiming of woman's sovereignty, etc., through goddess traditions, etc. This is one of the next great contentions, right? And from, even though Starhawk was an initiated witch, in the sense of lineage, was initiated by Victor and Cora Anderson into the fairy tradition. But this book definitely kind of blew things up in a big way, because it was saying what I guess is true, that if you're a witch, you're a witch. No one can tell you you're not, and no one can tell you you are. And so this idea that was happening in the 70s, that certainly some women's political groups would say, like WITCH in the US, would say things like, all you have to do to become a witch or know yourself as a witch is say, I am a witch 3 times and know it to be true, And actually, I consider that to be absolutely witchy. Like, if I think, oh yeah, because it's not just that some people maybe are born with that predispositional proclivity, and maybe they only realize that later, and in retrospect or hindsight, or maybe they just kind of know it all along. But really, the choice, like, to become a witch, you have to choose it, right? Either, and we have all of these like pieces of history and pieces of law that say that: write your book in the devil's name, turn 3 times around to the left at midnight and kiss the nearest toad, fire gunshots at the moon, and for however many mornings in a row, walk backwards up a stream, like in these Appalachian folk traditions of becoming a witch. You have to decide you want to be one. And whether that's initiation via the witch powers, these spirits of witchcraft, or whether that is facilitated through a human lineage, it actually doesn't matter. A witchcraft initiation, most primally, is actually the one that happens between those tutelary powers of witchcraft, those your familiars of witchcraft that intercede and catalyze that initiation. That's the important one. If you then go through initiations in covenants and orders and name traditions, that's also great and can also facilitate those other initiations. But the important one as a witch is that you, of your own sovereignty, decide it to be so, right? And decide that you're going to go down that path and decide that you're going to walk the crooked way. And I guess one of the most empowering things about witchcraft as well for me is that it is, in all of its forms and manifestations, it is not a path that evokes a savior. We might have goddesses and spirits that aid in liberation and stuff like that. But it's not a path that evokes a savior. It's a path that evokes responsibility, like radical self-responsibility, and is, the work of magic is not the work of, certainly not meant to be the work of illusion or delusion. It's actually this work of of getting results, as Gerald Gardner said. I really like that kind of very pragmatic approach to magic. Magic is the art of getting results. Like, I do magic because I want things to happen, either within my own being or within the beingness around me. I want to see and feel and perceive effect. I want to pay rent. I want to get this car. I want to go on this. I want to go here. I want love. I want this banished from my life. I need this person bound to stop doing harm. Like, these are practical magic is very much at the center of witchcraft. And certainly there are spells and rituals in books like this that are totally for that. And witches generally say, this is not a metaphor, or it's not. There's a metaphoric or psychological layer to magic and magical practice, but actually at its heart, we mean that it's real. We mean that we're working with spirits and powers beyond our understanding at some point. We're creating intimacy and cultivating this deep appreciation for, and perhaps even growing knowledge of the secret workings of nature, so that we too can participate in growth, in the cycles of growth and birth and death, decay and regeneration, that we too are invested with the same creative, destructive, dynamic powers as the gods, right? So witchcraft is certainly also not a tradition or system or ethos that is about obedience, and certainly we can see that consistently throughout its history. It's actually one of sovereignty and self-possession, authority, and kind of like commanding your own depths, so that you can attract these mighty powers to consider you as a peer and a co-conspirator and a consort, so that you can sorcerously alter things. That is very much a part of the definition of witchcraft, throughout the eras and throughout many cultures. And certainly books like The Spiral Dance and many of the books that are now available, and books that even I've written, are very much about here's a way or a series of techniques or some ideas or some law for you to adapt or use or internalize or be provoked by or work with or hate on, so that you can cultivate and curate and understand your own triggers, your own magical sources of power, your own relationships to the mysteries and the spirits, so that you can, create and sustain and deepen this path, this journey. I want to go back in time for a minute and go back to Aradia, because I mentioned spirits of liberation. So one of the kind of the sources of inspiration for early witchcraft sects and traditions and like self-storying and self-reflection is Aradia, this book that was published in, I believe, 1899 by Charles Godfrey Leland, who was a folklorist, like a known folklorist, also a political satirist in the United States, but was someone who collected a lot of lore and information about Rom people, about certain First Nations tribes. I can't remember the exact ones in Turtle Island, and certainly these Tuscan witches he discovered, right? This edition, which is really hard to come by, and I'm so lucky I have one, this was a gift to me, is actually a new translation. This came out years ago, but it's a new translation by people, by Mario Pazzaglini and Dina Pazzaglini, and with additional material by various scholars of witchcraft, like like in the academe, and practitioners of witchcraft who actually contextualize some of this, 19th century material, which may in fact be older, because they are from those areas, or because they have knowledge of that language. Because the original manuscript that he received, Charles Leyland had to translate, and he wasn't always the best at translating this Italian. But in here, what we find is a heretical witchcraft sect or tradition that calls upon a goddess of the beginnings that is so common in witchcraft traditions today, who is called Diana, and she is the goddess of the moon and the goddess of the night, and she is, the great mother of witches, blah, 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 blah. And she has this brother who is called Lucifer, the light bearer, in Latin. Also could be identified as Apollo, like this classical idea of Diana and Apollo being twins. And then that from their union, which is explored, there's creation stories in here, there's stories of their union in here, comes Aradia, who is a corruption probably of Herodias, which is again a reference to a biblical character. But then there's been scholarly research into this kind of night flying fairy goddess witch spirit in various parts of Italy and Eastern Europe, and they've discovered that she is there, Herodiada, Aragiusta, and that this would be Aradia in modern either Italian or just in the way that language develops. And she's this daughter of these witch gods, and she herself is like a prophet, a messiah. So here you've got some interesting heresy, because how dare you have, in the Christian context, a female avatar of God, right? But she's teaching things to the witches that are incredibly liberationist and really full on. And certainly if you are aware of Doreen Valiente's versions of The Charge of the Goddess, you will, in what I'm about to read, you will notice that she drew from this. So here we go. I'm going to read one of the translations. This is the gospel of the witches. Diana greatly loved her brother Lucifer, the god of the sun and of the moon, the god of light, who was so proud of his beauty and who for his pride was driven from paradise. Diana had by her brother a daughter, to whom they gave the name of Aradia, and in the text, i.e. Herodias. In those days there were on earth many rich and many poor. The rich made slaves of all the poor. In those days were many slaves who were cruelly treated, in every palace tortures, in every castle prisons and prisoners. Many slaves escaped. They fled to the country. Thus they became thieves and evil folk. Instead of sleeping by night, they plotted escape and robbed their masters and then slew them. So they dwelt in the mountains and forests as robbers and assassins, all to avoid slavery. And this is coming from Diana to her daughter Aradia. 'Tis true indeed that thou a spirit art, but thou wert born but to become again a mortal. Thou must go to earth below to be a teacher unto women and men who fain would study witchcraft in thy school. Yet like Cain's daughter thou shalt never be, nor like the race who have become at last wicked and infamous from suffering, as are the Jews and wandering Zingari, who are all thieves and knaves. Like unto them you shall not be. And so I just want to stop there and acknowledge that that is often, that is either, like in that reading, because this is Leyland's translation, either incredibly anti-Semitic, which was a prevailing attitude and still is, or as other people have translated it, including Jewish witches today. So these are two main perspectives. That what they're talking about is that the oppression and suffering of the Jews in Europe had created, like an existence of marginalized oppression. And that, yeah, and I'll stop there because I don't feel I should have to represent those views. It's either, this is the view from Jewish witches I understand, or and it's anti-Semitic. So I'm going to stop there and say that and acknowledge that as I read. And thou shalt be the first of witches known, and thou shalt be the first of all in the world, and thou shalt teach the art of poisoning those who are great lords of all, Ye, thou shalt make them die in their palaces, and thou shalt bind the oppressor's soul with power. And when you find a peasant who is rich, then you shall teach the witch your pupil how to ruin all his crops with tempest dire, with lightning and with thunder terrible, and the hail and the wind. And when a priest shall do you injury by his benedictions, you shall do to him double the harm, and do it in the name of me, Diana, queen of witches all. And when the priests of the nobility or the nobility shall say to you that you should put your faith in the Father, Son, and Mary, then reply, your God the Mother and Maria are three devils. But the true God the Father is not yours, for I have come to sweep away the bad, the men of evil, all will I destroy. Ye who are poor suffer with hunger keen, and toil and wretchedness, and suffer too full oft imprisonment. Yet with it all ye have a soul, and for your sufferings ye shall be happy in the other world, but ill the fate of all who do ye wrong. Now when Aradia had been taught to work all witchcraft, how to destroy the evil race of oppressors, she imparted it to her pupils, and said unto them, when I shall have departed from this world, whenever ye have need of anything, that line is literally used in the chart of the goddess, once in the month, and when the moon is full, ye shall assemble in some desert place or in a forest, all together join, to adore the potent spirit of your queen, my mother, great Diana, she who fain would learn all sorcery, yet has not won its deepest secrets. Them my mother will teach her in truth all things as yet unknown. And you shall all be freed from slavery, and so you shall be free in everything. And as the sign that ye are truly free, ye shall be naked in your rights, both men and women also. This shall last until the last of your oppressors shall be dead, and ye shall make the game of Benevento, extinguishing the lights, and after that shall hold your supper thus. And then it goes into how to hold the supper, or the treguenda, or the sabbat of these Aradian witches. So that is also a really important part to remember, especially in the development of Western witchcraft, because that is hugely this ethos of liberation, this ethos of marginalized and oppressed classes using witchcraft and magic to fight oppressor classes is quite an established trope, an established mythic thread. And certainly when I have looked at other cultures that honor sorcery and spirits and have professional and initiated spirit workers, that is a strong thread. So you see this in the idea of a crisis cult as explored by Kenneth Johnson in Witchcraft and the Shamanic Journey, which is a book that deeply influenced me when I was in high school. It's out of print, but you can find it, I think, maybe on Kindle. And I've lost my copy of it. But he talks about this idea of the crisis cult, and as the 14th century, because Aradia was said to be born in 1333 by some Italian witches. I would look up Raven Grimasi's books about that, who passed a few years ago. So you have this idea that they're, with the peasant revolts, with, feudal systems, that there are people who will work with magic and draw upon older things or transgressive things or things that are socially unsanctioned or socially banned to liberate, to create liberation, to affect liberation, to catalyze liberation. And so we have that in the ghost dances of some tribes in so-called US. We also have this idea of Haitian voodoo as at one time providing or coming through as a crisis cult. And certainly Haiti was, within its own mythology and history and experience, was one of the first enslaved groups of people or nations to liberate themselves. And how did they do that? In the stories and the histories, they did it by appealing to their Loa, their ancestral great spirits, and using magic against the French imperial forces. And so this idea of witches or witchcraft or sorcery as spirit work being used in this way is quite established. Certainly also in the frontier wars within Australia, there are several warriors who are also said to be featherfoot people or Kadaicha or sorcerers or wizards, and that the colonial invading forces were terrified of them. Like Pemulwuy is one of them. So that's an established idea. And certainly witches are kind of long considered to be champions of the underdog and champions of the marginalized, and working sorcery and spirit work to undo or dismantle things like empire, which I think is really, for me, one of the main reasons witchcraft exists. But I guess what I would say to kind of culminate this, because I've been going for a while, but really I could keep going, and there could be so many iterations of this, is that, you know, witchcraft primordially seems to be simply a human phenomenon that exists everywhere under various names, and that it is largely about several things. It is about intimacy with uncanny otherworldly powers and that capacity within oneself. It is about being able to move through time and space to affect that sorcery, and it is from those alliances and covenants, and it is about confronting forces of oppression and systems of oppression, and providing the people, usually of especially if there's classes systems, which there have been for so long, the marginalized, the oppressed, the most marginalized, the most oppressed, to draw upon inner authority and power and ancient tradition and ancient beings in order to commit to the works of liberation and drawing, like, being powerful. Like, I think most people would be kidding themselves if they said, oh, look, I'm not in witchcraft for power. Like witchcraft is essentially about power, and it's also essentially about relationship. It's also, I think, essentially about intimacy. And so how does intimacy, relationship, and power, you know, create this cauldron, this three-legged cauldron that boils this brew that we call witchcraft? And so I think I flashed a lot of works at you. Also, you know, Carlo Ginzburg's Eclecticism, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbat is a really important read. I flashed that at you. There was a time in history where books like this became kind of the done thing, A Witch Alone, you know, Marion Green. This is quite a good book. I prefer it over Scott Cunningham's Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner. I just, you know, the aesthetic and the flavor of this witchcraft that she talks about is just more my thing. I actually only recently read this book because I thought I should, to understand more of the history of this idea of the solitary witch, as opposed to the coven witch, which was such a strong idea. And certainly, you know, books like Mastering Witchcraft, although it had ingredients for how to form a coven, etc., and Spiral Dance, and even though she also really encourages you to form groups and covens, like there, after the 70s, you have this, in the 80s, you have this, and the 90s, you have this, like, well, you don't need to be in a coven, you don't need to be initiated in any established group or lineage or order, you can just do it on your own. And this is true, you can just do it on your own. And I would also say that I have, you know, that's what I did in high school. And for me, it was essential to seek out teachers, both otherworldly and more than human and human, in order to deepen and refine my practice. So that's where I would leave it. That is some of what I would say today about the histories and unfolding of witchcraft. And I hope you've enjoyed my ranting.